Thank you so much. I'm going to share the thoughts from my group, and then I'll go to our facilitators and get their closing, and then I'll close. So with our group, I had a wonderful group with such an emotional conversation, and we started about one of our members talking about how he managed data, and he was asked to do something he felt was illegal, and the lack of transparency really was this form of like distrust and insecurities, you know, and how not sharing really hinders us. And also he found that working together and collaborating, you know, is critical for a great outcome because of the diversity. And we had another member that kind of went along with that and talked about how, you know, when you're looking at a macro level and people are looking at macro, one person has the where and the why of where we're going. And then we go to the micro level in an organization of the how, the people who are doing it. How do we do this? And we put it together, and everyone holds a piece of the puzzle, a piece of the information, and together we can move forward with that. And you know, information is needed to see, you know, where we're going to go instead of by chance. We don't want to happen somewhere. We can go intentionally somewhere. And if we become obsessed with hoarding this information and with being in charge, then that's a detriment to health as an individual, because you're so clogged up and you're overworking, and health as an organization and society when we just kind of close off on that. And it's about egoless leadership. And really the sum of our, you know, we all kind of came together when we talked about fear. Hoarding information, not wanting transparency comes from fear, the things that we fear. And when we're looking at it and we're having, you know, to share, what are we afraid of with sharing information? What are we afraid of with sharing our resources for those who have less, especially for those who have, you know, so much? And we talked about how instantly when we talk about information and access and all of these social justice issues, we immediately go to how do we empower those with less? But we also have to really think about how we empower those who have more, to embrace their humanity and let go of the fear that maybe they were taught to hoard and to give, not to give to people. And so how can we take little steps to do that? And we had great examples of cajoling members, friends and family to give to the less fortunate, getting information out there, using the time that we have when maybe someone else doesn't have time to research, that we would research for them, and to keep an open mind and to constantly work on what are we afraid of and how can we move past that? What would we have to lose? So I just want to thank my team again. I hope I encompassed our lovely thoughts, and I will turn it over to our other facilitator. And I'm so sorry I don't have that list, but I'm assuming Miss Natalie Bornia.
I thought you might have come my way, having climbed the bridge. Good afternoon, everyone. We had a great time in our breakout room talking about information mostly. So in our room, we had our opening speaker, amazing. We also had a native New Yorker who shared that growing up in her household, the focus was not really on politics. It was more on religion and faith. But coming into adulthood and just recognizing the urgency and the importance of our work, this generation and others, in politics, so that we can salvage and not lose some of the great things that have been created for us, is so important. And so her reality is, at this time, we need to go harder and just keep going. We also had a graduate student in our group who actually is not able to vote, but she actually said, I am comforted because she has been having great conversations with her peers, some of whom have the right to vote, and she's encouraged them to exercise it. And so through them, she is feeling like, I am making a difference because I can do something. And the something I can do is to talk about how I feel, what's important, share information so that we are all on the same page. We had another individual in our group who is an esteemed scientist, very knowledgeable, very seasoned, who rightly pointed out that we are in a state of information overload. There is so much information. And within that great information is a lot of fake news. Because think about it, any kind of information in and of itself is imperfect. There are extremes. Nothing is absolute. The difference is how we process it, how much we go below the surface to validate and ensure that we understand, because knowledge does not equal understanding. But what we are seeing is there's so many platforms that we would consider legitimate that have adapted and have pushed out and massaged this disinformation, so that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between, well, is that right or not? And we find some of the most educated people, professionals, seem to be speaking information in a way that is completely foreign to us. And it's frightening sometimes the way information is used. So there is just, we talked about the importance of really seeking the truth. And someone also said in our group, recognize that the truth is sometimes selective, because even the most legitimate of news agencies will report the news at a certain slant, because they know the environment they're in leads them to be selective in the way they share news. So our reality is really, we can't live in a bubble. We really need to socialize the way we're doing now. We need to have conversations as adults, taking in information and not just running with it, but making sure that we're moving from that singular lens to the multidimensional, multicultural lens, having conversations and not just staying in our lane, because the environment we're in influences the way we think, influences what we hear, what we say, how we act. And really, in 2020, as the opening speaker said, we have so much access. There's so many barriers that have been removed, yet there are a lot of untruths that reside in the information that we take in. We also touched on voter suppression, which is a stark reality that cannot be denied. Voter, protections were rolled back in 2013. 2013 was just like yesterday, 2013 yesterday. 2013, voter protection laws were rolled back because they were deemed by conservatives to not be necessary. We are in, who needs protection? Well, who needs protection? People who don't have photo IDs, who are now asked to provide photo identification at polling stations, because they don't drive, they don't have a driver's license, they've never left their state or their block, really, so they don't have a passport. So the reality that some people do not have photo IDs is real, especially in underserved communities. We also saw a lot of polling stations close after 2013. Think about it. When did we start to see these lines wrapping around buildings of people waiting and waiting and waiting to vote? Why? Polling stations were closed. So when you hear voter suppression, when you hear certain terminology, don't discount it. As our opening speaker said, do your homework, be familiar and socialize, talk about it so that you are in the right position to have the right conversation, to make the right move and provide the right impact.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Yes, to so much of that. Just yes, yes, yes. I love it. Thank you so much. Dr. Clifton?
Dr. Clifton, if you could unmute.
Our group met and we sort of stayed on subject of how you information can be used to formulate coalitions of interest that then we can we see what is, and then we have to formulate ways to make what is possible. That that was the point that we really stuck on most of the time. How to go about creating this change, how to bring people together. We had some very experienced people in our group, and who have worked with data for many years, and on a broad political level, and on political campaigns, and also on community projects. And he brought up a very interesting point that we have to know that underlying broader politics is money and power. We can never forget that. But on a trying to develop people's understanding, we can move from online communication to offline, where people can start to talk, and that it's offline. That's where possibilities of change takes place, of change of attitude. It's within attitude that needs to change with broad people. We talked about how we're so oppositional now that there's very little dialogue from one side to the other at all. So it's sort of I mean, I talked to like 40 patients this week, and I would say the majority are worried about violence after Tuesday. That's the biggest fear, and this fear. This isn't the kind of way to exercise power. It only ends in death and destruction. So, and I didn't bring it up, but I thought about in the 60s when we were rallying around Berkeley or at the University of Pennsylvania, we could have dialogues with oppositions and screaming matches, but now oppositions aren't allowed to speak in certain areas. That's not going to bring about understanding. But there were just tremendous suggestions of tactics that we can use, enthusiasm and energy, but we kept going back as like we come together, and then how do we create change? And we're growing in that opportunity. And then also we brought up the idea that we're in an auspicious period in history in the United States, where a lot of the defense mechanisms have been torn off by reality, and people are frightened, and in that case they're more open for some dialogue, or they're more open. Patient of mine, I'm upstate today, went to Walmart to buy bullets last weekend, and they were all sold out, which is that never happens. I'm not doing it to create fear, but it was just a fact, an anecdote. That's that. But I think we kind of concluded that we have to keep believing in the auspicious moment and keep working towards it, and feel that some good can come out of this stalemate. And but we have to see what happens on Tuesday, and hope it does happen and concludes a count. So it was a very productive, lively discussion. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clifton, and to your group as well. Yes, no matter what happens, I think continue to come together and have that belief that we can work through this for something better. And to round us and take us home, Jerome?
Yes, so first of all, I had a super awesome group with a lot of positive energy. I had people smiling all the time and being very positive. And the theme was really engagement. And by engagement, there are a little bit of a few themes here. And so the first one in terms of a theme is, of course, we have an election in a few days. And the idea that most everybody was essentially engaged in this process, and engaged by trying to make essentially voting more accessible, teaching people how to vote, teaching people on not being intimidated in going to the poll, with the process itself as well. And informing people about their rights. It's a little bit like our introduction speaker said, information access is a human right, and be sure that everybody understand that and they can really express their opinion. And, something that came up is that helper engage can sometimes need to translate the information so it may be more accessible to people. And by more accessible is that, there are a lot of newcomers and immigrants, and perhaps only a few years have been Americans, and trying to drive them through this process. And this very obscure way to describe perhaps an election, or even the odd of you being able to make a change and having a voice. And we had also another example where essentially other people were engaged in calling, essentially do the call by their phone, and also writing letters. And there was this theme that having this personal touch in terms of providing information, which basically handwriting, is something which is so different from essentially, bland information, right? And people doing this, I think, universally felt like being engaged by doing those things is also not only feeling that you are part of tomorrow's outcome, but it was also very rewarding to see, for example, that sending 200 letters in different states have allowed to reach people that would otherwise not even think of perhaps coming out and voting. And one person said, well, I actually saw a New York Times article saying that it did make a difference and it made me feel good. So that was an interesting feedback, I thought. The other thought was about the information accuracy and how all of this pulled together. And one thought was that the millennials are especially engaged today and are very versatile with technology, right? So they like to use tools, and sometimes they even use like a phone to translate, or I talk and suddenly, boom, the characters appear in another language. So that's actually something that has not been necessarily seen before. So the use of social media has not engaged a millennium, but it has allowed them to be engaged at maximum efficiency or maximum impact, because they know how to use those tools. But of course, we also graze the fact that information needs to be checked. When you go on Facebook, you get opinions, not information. So while the New York City and the government site provide information that is minimally vetted, and sometimes a bit biased, of course, depending on who put this information, the information remains accurate. But when you find information online, be sure that it is peer-reviewed, or be sure that you go indeed in depth, that you double check that this information comes from trusted source. And one of the themes that we had is that sometimes you get hypnotized by the information. And I like that, this hypnotized by information. And by this, we meant also that, there was an interesting example. You go and try to buy life insurance and you are being sweet talked in essentially getting into something, or you go and your financial advisor is telling you, oh, buy this life insurance or buy this thing, it's going to be great for you. And you actually don't understand, because what you are being sold are ideas, tidbits, graph, something that looks colorful, nice. And the idea is that when this comes, don't be afraid to take a step back and say, I'll come back with proper information. I'll come back with someone who is more knowledgeable. I will come back with someone who can advocate for me, because I don't know everything and I need someone who knows and can help. And that's very important in our everyday life as an advice. Don't feel that you are hypnotized by information or you're overburdened by a mass of information. Try to use your neighbor, your friends, your advocate, people more knowledgeable to actually help you through. And the last theme that we touched was actually a wonderful theme. And it started by recognizing that some of the people feel like they should be engaged in this election because their parents actually were engaged, and they just felt like I would not do anything else than being engaged because that's kind of a tradition. And the 200 letter writing was actually done by one of our attendants that did this with her granddaughter. And then suddenly we all realized that all of this engagement that has not been seen in a long time. Someone even mentioned that since the civil rights movement, we have not seen people being engaged as spontaneously as now. But what is important is not in tomorrow's win or lose of the election. What is important is that the young generation was engaged. A lot of people were engaged. And there was a totally rise up from the ground up of an awareness of the issue and that and how important it is for the youngster to be actually not only engaged but carry the torch later. The same way that one of the attendants said, my parents were engaged, I am engaged. Today, people were engaged. They brought their son, daughter, granddaughter, grandson, and they are the hope for tomorrow. And we end it by thinking that taking a step back and looking at all of that and that engagement and this engagement of the youngster, we need to also see all of this movement as a lot of positive energy. And that's, we started with a smiling group and a positive group, and we ended with this message of positiveness.
Thank you so much, Jerome. You guys really dug into that and a lot of positivity there. I love all the themes that your group developed and all the groups. So I'm going to share my closing thoughts on this, and a lot of it kind of surmises what we had already talked about. But as Albert Einstein once said, information is not knowledge. Information is the raw data, knowledge is the processing of this data, and change is the action taken based on the process of the data, for lack of a better analogy. That's how I kind of think about information that leads to knowledge that leads to action. So if knowledge is power because it is a connector between information and action, so that means the lack of knowledge is removing power from ourselves and people in general. Like we said, we log onto our computers and we're inundated with information. It can be so overwhelming and we can't process all of it to knowledge. So then what happens is we become stagnant in our growth individually and in turn as a community. And it really reminds me of a technique of corporate law and how they deal with individuals, lawsuits, whatever. They bury the small guy in paperwork until they give up or run out of money. Because 95% of that paperwork, aka information, is irrelevant. And the important information is not easily accessible when you have a mountain to dig through. But information is critical because we don't know what we don't know. So to turn information into knowledge, we need to give ourselves space to process the information. How you can give yourself space is recognizing that you don't have to think about all the problems all at once. You know, pick something that is on your heart or affecting you or your loved ones. Give yourself permission to not take in all the information. Ask questions to try to get to the root of what you should be spending your time uncovering or working on. Questions I have discovered in my work is the biggest tool in our toolbox. And then, so we got the information, and then now we have knowledge. You have the power. What do you do with that? You act. And acting doesn't look like a feel-good movie montage. You are not expected to change the world in one day or to do it by yourself. Small steps are action. Invite people to join a CTD event. Post about it. We had a couple of our facilitators mention that dialogue is important. So spreading the words about coalitions or platforms like CTD is very important because dialogue with people will lead to more information, lead to more knowledge, lead to more power. You can donate, you can connect with others who are trying to make a change, etc. Small steps are the building blocks of massive change. Knowledge is power is a term referred to typically with education, but education is a place in our society that gets the most budget cuts and is often overlooked. Why? Because knowledge is power. And if we control who gets access, then we can control who to oppress. So knowledge is power, and it is our responsibility as individuals to claim that power because it will not be given to us. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.